Hands up.
Right now. I'm an Admiral.
Take it easy.
You're not cooperating. Turn around.
This is a mistake.
Flight control, need a unit at checkpoint B.
Let's go, sir.
I'm Navy. Listen.
Stop resisting.
I'm Navy. Down. Get your hands behind you.
The video opens in disorder, not with a clean crime scene, but with overlapping emergencies colliding at once. Voices stack over each other. Movement is frantic. Authority is not yet centralized. This is the moment before control arrives, when violence has already happened, and the system is racing to catch up. What matters here is not only that shots were fired, but how rapidly confusion hardens into command, and how quickly the narrative of responsibility begins to form. The opening seconds establish a critical imbalance. Multiple civilians are present, including children. A man is injured. Another individual is identified almost immediately as the shooter. Yet the scene is not stabilized. Officers are still negotiating space, attempting to separate bodies, voices, and emotions. This is the fragile window where errors compound. Every instruction given or ignored reshapes what comes next. From the outset, officers are forced to make decisions without the luxury of full context. They are responding to an active shooter call inside a residence. That classification alone elevates threat perception. The priority becomes containment, securing the house, preventing further harm, and identifying the armed individual. In these moments, law enforcement training emphasizes control over conversation. Commands replace questions. Compliance becomes the currency of safety. We see that immediately. Directions are given sharply, repeatedly, and without negotiation. Individuals are told where to stand, where to move, and where not to go. Resistance, even verbal, is treated as potential escalation. This is not misconduct. It is standard protocol in a scene where a firearm has already been discharged. But protocol has limits, and those limits are tested when civilians are emotionally overwhelmed, injured, or attempting to care for others. A central tension emerges almost instantly. The conflict between human instinct and procedural necessity. Family members are trying to reach one another. Someone wants to go back inside. Someone else wants medical help now. Officers, meanwhile, are operating under the assumption that the shooter may still be inside the home. This assumption is reasonable, but it has consequences. It transforms every civilian into a possible obstruction and every movement into a threat vector. When officers begin calling for the suspect to exit the house, the power dynamic shifts decisively. And the situation moves from chaotic aftermath to controlled confrontation. The house becomes a focal point of danger. The individual inside is no longer just a family member in a dispute. He is now framed as an armed suspect in a violent felony. This reframing is crucial. It strips away personal context and replaces it with legal identity. The suspect is ordered to come out with hands up. This command is not symbolic. It is a legal threshold. At this point, probable cause has crystallized. Shots were fired, a person was struck, children were present. Even without motive clarity, the elements of attempted murder are already forming. The law does not require understanding why yet, only that it happened. As the suspect exits, officers assert full control over his body. He is directed to kneel. His movements are dictated step by step. This is the visual moment where authority becomes absolute. Whatever emotional chaos existed before is now subordinate to officer command presence. The suspect's attempts to speak, explain, or minimize are irrelevant at this stage. The priority is weapon control and scene safety. What's important is not just that the suspect complies, but how officers interpret his demeanor. He appears verbal, animated, attempting to frame the incident as less serious than it is. This is a classic post-incident behavior pattern. Minimization. It is an instinctive response, not a legal strategy. People often downplay severity in moments of shock, especially when they believe they were provoked. But from a law enforcement perspective, this behavior does not reduce culpability. It often increases suspicion. Meanwhile, medical concerns are unfolding in parallel. The injured individual is conscious, speaking, and mobile. Officers assess visible wounds quickly, determining that bleeding is not immediately life-threatening. This assessment influences pacing. Once officers believe no one is actively dying, investigative control accelerates. Questions begin to replace commands. Here, the narrative begins to fracture. Different participants offer overlapping but inconsistent accounts. Items allegedly missing. Long-standing family tension, verbal disrespect, financial strain. These explanations arrive not as a coherent story, but as fragments, and that matters because law enforcement builds cases on consistency. Discrepancies are not merely confusing, they are evidentiary warning signs. A critical detail emerges. The firearm was discharged from inside the house, through a window, toward a person outside. This fact alone dramatically narrows legal defenses. Self-defense claims rely on immediacy and proportionality. Shooting through a barrier at someone who is outside and not actively attacking undermines both. Distance matters, position matters, the direction of force matters. Officers probe this carefully, not with accusation but with clarification. Where was the shooter standing? Where was the victim? Who was trying to leave? Who was trying to stop whom? These are not casual questions. Each one maps directly onto statutory elements of violent crime. As witnesses describe efforts to physically restrain the shooter before the shots were fired, the picture becomes clearer and worse. The suspect was not reacting in a split second to an unavoidable threat. He was being actively prevented from escalating. That means there was time, and time erodes justification. Another critical factor surfaces. Children were in or near the line of fire. Even if they were not struck, their presence transforms the incident legally. Discharging a firearm in a way that endangers minors elevates charges significantly. Intent toward the children is not required. Risk alone is enough. Officers' tone shifts as this becomes apparent. The conversation tightens. Clarifying questions give way to confirmation. The system is locking into place. This is no longer an ambiguous domestic disturbance. It is an attempted homicide with aggravating factors. The suspect's own statements inadvertently reinforce this. He frames the conflict as long-standing, rooted in disrespect and missing property. This is not a threat narrative, it is a grievance narrative. Courts do not view grievances as justification for lethal force. In fact, they often establish motive. At this point, the video illustrates a recurring institutional reality. Escalation rarely hinges on one moment. It is cumulative. Years of unresolved conflict, financial stress, crowded living arrangements, emotional immaturity, a firearm accessible in the home. None of these individually cause violence. Together, they create inevitability. Law enforcement enters only at the end of that chain. By the time officers arrive, the critical failure has already occurred. Their role is not to prevent the violence, that opportunity is gone, but to document it, contain it, and translate chaos into charges. The suspect is ultimately identified, detained, and separated from the narrative he is trying to control. Officers recover information about the firearm's location. Statements from multiple parties align on key facts despite emotional variance. The system does what it is designed to do: isolate the actor, preserve evidence, and move toward prosecution. What makes this case particularly instructive is how ordinary the catalyst is. A missing household item, a verbal confrontation, a decision to follow instead of disengage. These are mundane triggers. But when combined with access to a gun and an inability to tolerate perceived disrespect, they become lethal accelerants. The video does not show a monster. It shows a man who made a series of small, disastrous decisions, none of which seemed catastrophic in isolation. That is precisely why the outcome is so severe. The law is not concerned with how trivial the argument was. It is concerned with what was done in response. By the end of Part 1, the trajectory is unmistakable. The power has shifted completely from family conflict to institutional authority. The suspect's explanations are now evidence, not narrative. The house is no longer a home. It is a crime scene. And the question is no longer what happened, but how many lines were crossed in the process. By the time Part 2 begins, the emotional chaos that dominated the opening moments has been replaced by something colder and more procedural. This is the phase where the system asserts itself fully, not through force, but through structure. Questions become deliberate. Statements are cataloged. Each answer is less about understanding feelings and more about fixing facts into a legal framework that will not change later. What's striking is how quickly personal narratives collide with institutional logic. Family members continue to describe the incident as the result of tension that had been building for years. Financial strain, disrespect, crowded living conditions. A sense that boundaries had eroded long before the day violence erupted. These explanations are emotionally coherent, but legally irrelevant. The law does not weigh emotional exhaustion. It weighs actions. Officers repeatedly return to sequence: who moved first, who followed whom, where each person was standing. This insistence on order is not pedantic. It is foundational. Criminal liability hinges on chronology. A single step forward or backward can determine whether a shooting is framed as defensive, reckless, or intentional. Here, the timeline becomes increasingly damning. The shooter was inside the house. The victim was outside. The door was closed. Others were actively trying to prevent further confrontation. These facts converge into a single conclusion. The immediate threat, if any had existed, had already passed. The danger was not approaching. It was retreating. That distinction matters profoundly. Self-defense law is built on necessity. Force is justified only when it is required to stop an imminent threat. Shooting through a window at someone who is no longer inside the space and who is not attacking fails that test. No amount of prior tension can resurrect imminence once distance and barriers are introduced. As officers probe this point, the shooter's explanations begin to fracture. He describes fear but cannot articulate a specific action that justified lethal force. He points to size differences, past disrespect, stolen property. These are contextual grievances, not immediate dangers. Each time he circles back to them, he unintentionally reinforces the absence of lawful justification. There is a subtle but important psychological element here. People often conflate emotional fear with legal fear. Feeling intimidated is not the same as facing an imminent threat. The law does not protect reactions to insult, disrespect, or long-term resentment. It protects responses to unavoidable harm. That gap becomes painfully clear as the interview continues. Another layer deepens the seriousness: the presence of children. Multiple accounts confirm that juveniles were nearby, some in a vehicle struck by gunfire. Even without physical injury, the act of firing toward an occupied area transforms the charged landscape. Risk alone is sufficient. The law treats children not as passive bystanders but as protected parties, whose endangerment triggers enhanced penalties. This is where institutional gravity fully settles in. Officers' demeanor shifts from neutral inquiry to firm containment. The questions now assume criminal conduct. They are no longer exploratory. The shooter is no longer being asked what happened. He is being asked to confirm details that will define charges. This transition is subtle but unmistakable. The firearm itself becomes central: where it was stored, how it was accessed, whether it was secured. These questions extend responsibility beyond the shooter alone. They touch on systemic issues: gun storage, household awareness, and shared risk. When firearms are present in volatile environments, every unresolved conflict becomes potentially lethal. The shooter's partner and family members express shock, not that a gun existed, but that it was carried into the confrontation. This distinction reveals a common and dangerous assumption: that firearms are only dangerous when intentionally deployed. In reality, proximity alone changes outcomes. The decision to bring a gun into an emotionally charged situation is often the decisive escalation, even before it is fired. Officers methodically dismantle the self-defense narrative by returning to physical reality. The shooter was restrained. He fell onto a couch. When the gun discharged from inside the house, the rounds traveled outward. These are not interpretive details, they are spatial facts. And spatial facts do not bend to emotional framing. As the investigation continues, we see the limits of family loyalty. While relatives attempt to contextualize behavior, they do not materially contradict the core facts. No one claims the victim was attacking at the moment shots were fired. No one describes a weapon in the victim's hands. Silence fills those gaps, and silence in legal context is revealing. The shooter's repeated emphasis on being provoked exposes another critical issue: escalation psychology. Escalation is rarely sudden. It is incremental, driven by perceived slights that accumulate until restraint collapses. The shooter describes long-term disrespect, ongoing disputes, a sense of being undermined in his own home. These perceptions create a narrative of entitlement, the belief that force is justified to reassert control or dignity. This belief is not uncommon, but it is profoundly incompatible with the law. The law does not recognize wounded pride as a defense. As officers document statements, they are not merely building a case against an individual, they are mapping a pattern. Domestic environments where multiple adults and children coexist under stress are statistically high risk. Add unresolved grievances and accessible firearms, and the probability of violence spikes. This case is not an anomaly, it is a predictable outcome of systemic neglect and personal failure. What's particularly instructive is how the shooter's own words close off alternative interpretations. He does not claim the gun discharged accidentally. He does not claim he was unaware of who was outside. In fact, he acknowledges knowing that children were present. That admission alone eliminates entire categories of defense. At this stage, the legal architecture is complete. Attempted murder, aggravating factors, endangerment of minors. Each charge rests on a different pillar, but they reinforce one another. The more the shooter speaks, the more those pillars solidify. Meanwhile, the victim's injuries, though not fatal, do not mitigate the severity. The law evaluates intent and action, not outcome alone. A missed artery does not reduce culpability. It reflects chance. Courts do not reward luck. The scene's emotional residue lingers. Family members oscillate between grief, disbelief, and resignation. There is no triumph, no catharsis. Only the slow realization that a moment of rage has permanently altered lives. Children will carry this memory. Relationships are irreparably fractured. Legal consequences loom, indifferent to remorse. This is where institutional failure becomes visible, not in police response, but in what preceded it. There were warning signs, long-standing disputes, crowded living arrangements born of economic pressure, a firearm present in an unstable environment. None of these were addressed before they converged into violence. Law enforcement arrives at the end of the story, not the beginning. By the time they intervene, the outcome is already set. Their role is not to heal the family, but to formalize the rupture. As Part 2 closes, the narrative has fully shifted from chaos to consequence. The shooter is no longer central as a person, but as a defendant. His story is no longer fluid. It is fixed in reports, statements, and evidence logs. The system has absorbed the incident and is now moving it forward inexorably toward prosecution. What remains unresolved is not what happened, but what this case reveals about how easily authority, fear, and access to violence intersect, and how rarely anyone intervenes before the intersection becomes catastrophic. By the time the final phase of the video unfolds, there is no ambiguity left in the system's posture. What began as chaos has been converted into record. What was once a family dispute is now a criminal case with clearly defined contours. The emotional noise fades, replaced by the quiet inevitability of consequence. This is the stage where nothing dramatic happens, and yet everything is decided. And the most telling aspect of Part 3 is not what anyone says, but what no one can undo. Statements are complete. Physical evidence has been identified. The firearm's location is known. The positions of the shooter and the victim are established. From an investigative standpoint, the case is already finished long before formal charges are announced. The remainder is administrative gravity, pulling everything downward. What becomes clear is how little room remains for reinterpretation. Earlier attempts to frame the shooting as fear-driven collapse under their own weight. Fear, in legal terms, must be tethered to immediacy. Here, immediacy is absent. The victim was outside. A door and window separated the parties. Others were actively intervening to prevent confrontation. Each of these elements independently weakens a self-defense claim. Together, they obliterate it. This is the moment when the difference between emotional truth and legal truth becomes absolute. Emotionally, the shooter may genuinely feel provoked, disrespected, and overwhelmed. Legally, none of that matters once the trigger is pulled under these conditions. The law does not punish feelings. It punishes conduct. And conduct in this case crossed multiple non-negotiable thresholds. The presence of children remains a central aggravator. It reframes the shooting from an interpersonal conflict into a public danger event. The law treats this distinction harshly for a reason. When minors are placed at risk by gunfire, intent becomes secondary to outcome probability. The system assumes the worst-case scenario because the margin for error is non-existent. This is why the charges escalate so dramatically. Attempted murder is not about whether someone died. It is about whether lethal force was intentionally deployed in a way that could reasonably cause death. Firing multiple rounds through a window toward occupied space satisfies that standard cleanly. The number of shots matters, the direction matters, the context matters. So does admission. The shooter's acknowledgement that he knew juveniles were present seals the case in a way no forensic detail ever could. That knowledge eliminates plausible deniability. It establishes awareness of risk, and awareness is the backbone of criminal intent. At this point, the video subtly illustrates another institutional reality. Remorse does not erase liability. Expressions of shock, disbelief, or regret, while human, do not alter the legal outcome. Courts may consider them during sentencing, but they do not undo charges. The system is not designed to rewind. It is designed to proceed. Family members continue to grapple with the consequences in real time. There is confusion, grief, and an almost desperate search for meaning in something that now feels senseless. The catalyst, a missing household item, becomes increasingly unbearable to acknowledge. As the scale of legal consequences comes into focus, the triviality of the trigger becomes its own form of punishment. This is one of the most difficult psychological reckonings in violent crime cases, realizing that life-altering outcomes were born from moments that in hindsight seem insignificant. But insignificance is irrelevant to the law. The law does not measure the worth of a dispute. It measures the proportionality of response, and here, the response was catastrophic relative to the trigger. That imbalance is precisely what the justice system exists to address. What the video also exposes is the illusion of control that firearms create. The shooter believed he was reclaiming authority over his space, his dignity, his grievance. In reality, the moment he fired, he surrendered all control. Control transferred instantly to the system: police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections. Every future decision will now be made by someone else. This is the paradox of armed escalation. The weapon feels empowering until it is used. Then it becomes an anchor. From a broader perspective, the case underscores how institutional failures often precede individual ones. Overcrowded living arrangements driven by economic pressure, unresolved interpersonal conflict, lack of mediation, easy firearm access without adequate safeguards. None of these are criminal on their own. Together, they form a predictable pathway to violence. Yet the system only intervenes after the fact. Law enforcement's role here is reactive, not preventative. Officers did not create the conflict. They did not escalate it. They arrived once the damage was done and executed their function efficiently. The tragedy lies not in their response, but in the absence of earlier intervention, social, familial, or structural, that might have prevented escalation. As the final charges are outlined, the full weight of the situation becomes unavoidable. Attempted murder, aggravated child abuse, discharging a firearm into a dwelling. Each charge reflects a different dimension of harm, and together they represent a comprehensive legal condemnation of the act. There is no narrative left to reclaim. The shooter's story, once loud, defensive, and insistent, has been reduced to evidence. His voice now exists only in transcripts and recordings, stripped of persuasion, frozen in time. The system does not argue with it, it files it. The children, though physically unharmed, are not untouched. Exposure to violence of this magnitude leaves psychological imprints that outlast court proceedings. The law can punish the offender, but it cannot restore a sense of safety once it has been shattered. That cost is never listed in charging documents, yet it is often the most enduring. As the video closes, there is no dramatic resolution, no confrontation, no moral pronouncement, just the quiet finality of a case moving forward. This absence of spectacle is itself revealing. Real accountability is rarely cinematic. It is procedural, slow, and indifferent to emotion. And that may be the most important takeaway. This case is not exceptional because of its violence. It is exceptional because of how ordinary everything leading up to it was. The argument, the resentment, the belief that force would settle what conversation could not. These are common failures. The difference here is that a gun was present and used. Once that line is crossed, the outcome is no longer negotiable. The video ends not with justice delivered, but with justice set in motion. And in that distinction lies the true weight of authority. Not the authority to command a scene, but the authority to permanently alter lives through the enforcement of consequence. Nothing about this ending feels victorious. It feels heavy. It feels inevitable. And it leaves behind a question that the system itself cannot answer. How many similar trajectories are already underway, unnoticed, until the moment a trigger is pulled and it is too late to intervene? The law will respond every time. The tragedy is that it always arrives last.